West Virginia. America's Roundabout Interchange merging north, south, east, and west. By Robert Allen Burton. I grew up as a West Virginian. I've traveled through every state in the Union except Hawaii. This great nation has many diverse and dazzling cities and a multitude of natural wonders, and I feel blessed to have seen so much of it. Yet with all the beauty and excitement I found elsewhere, my fondness of my home state has nonetheless increased. But one constant source of annoyance has dogged me while traveling out of state. When asked where I am from, I tell people I am from West Virginia. Time and time again this is met with responses such as, "So what's Virginia like, and what brings you here from Virginia?" I can't be angry at these well-meaning people for their questions asked out of ignorance, so partially my bitterness is directed toward their geography teachers that failed to instill in them knowledge that West Virginia and Virginia are two completely different states, every bit as different as Pennsylvania is from New York and Florida is from Georgia. I also directed another portion of resentment toward the founding legislators of the state who voted for the name of West Virginia over the alternative option Pinala, that is until I moved to the town of Grafton, West Virginia. I am sure that you have heard this said, the importance of learning history is to avoid repeating past mistakes. Well, I was convinced that one of those past mistakes was choosing the name West Virginia over the name assigned to this land territory by the natives, Pinala. In fact, for a brief period while traveling through other states, a West Virginian friend and I agreed that when asked where are you from, we would answer Pinala. But this answer was always followed with another question, where is that? And ultimately the answer West Virginia became necessary anyway, so our grassroots attempt to change the name of the state was abandoned. Soon after becoming a resident of Grafton, I gained a whole new perspective on this issue. Actually, it was my 13-year-old son who pointed out to me that Grafton has the feel of a western town, and he referenced examples of western wear worn by a few citizens. Main Street architecture also presents everything you would expect from an idealistic western town. I began to re-examine what I understood about the history of Grafton, and I realized that even geographically speaking, Grafton is a western town. Now you may be thinking Grafton is not geographically west, it's not even the Midwest, it's the Mid-Atlantic, but if you're willing to take a brief journey back in time to the years just prior to the foundation of this great nation, I do believe you shall be persuaded. Once upon a time, 1748, there was a young man named George Washington. At 16 years of age, he took part in a surveying expedition on behalf of Lord Thomas Fairfax. This trip west took Washington to the Appalachian frontier on the worst road ever rode by man or beast. This epic adventure led Washington into the frontier and to the base of the Eastern Continental Divide. This ridge line presented a difficult barrier for Europeans, explorers, and settlers. This is especially true at the portion of the ridge line Washington visited, but this route was most direct, straight west route from where Annapolis, Maryland, where the expedition began. It was discovered that precipitation which falls on the east side of the Continental Divide flows east and ultimately into the Atlantic Ocean, and that which falls on the western side flows toward the Mississippi and into the Gulf of Mexico. Due to treaties between England and the indigenous peoples, these highlands that deeply affected young George Washington remained Indian territory. Strengthened and made bold, in part by his adventures as a surveyor, George Washington grew into a mighty leader, and before the onset of the Revolutionary War he traveled beyond the Continental Divide and down the Ohio River, yet he did so by traveling through Pennsylvania across mountains less large and rugged, the ones he had witnessed as a teenager when he approached what is now known as West Virginia. When George Washington became president, he commissioned the construction of national roads, and one of those is a road now known as US Route 50. It was built in sections, and those sections were called by various names in different states. Presently it is all called US Route 50 except for the section from San Francisco to West Sacramento. I can personally attest that in San Francisco there are signs for US Route 50 which guide drivers all the way until road officially becomes US Route 50, so for all practical purposes US Route 50 connects to San Francisco. For the sake of reducing confusion, I will refer to the entirety of Washington's westward route as 50. It runs through the very terrain that a young George Washington traveled as a teenager with the Fairfax surveying team. When completed, it extended all the way from Ocean City, Maryland to San Francisco, California. Although Washington did not live to see its completion, he did travel the route as far as Mount Storm, which is at the crest of the Eastern Continental Divide. Fittingly, Route 50 got the nickname the George Washington Highway, which still appears on road signs today in SA section of road in western Maryland. Some of the mountain passes between Mt. Storm and present-day Grafton retrace paths made by the footsteps of Native Americans who walked the forest for centuries prior to horse and buggy traffic. US Route 50 brought settlers into the area that would become Grafton on a dirt road that winds like a snake through the wild wooded mountains of north-central West Virginia. It was traveled by horse and buggies for longer than it has thus far been traveled by automobiles. Its construction westward enabled the expanse of the nation. The very names of the places it connects to the nation's capital testify to the historic importance of this road. St. Louis, Missouri, Dodge City, Kansas, and Carson City, Nevada are points in between Washington, D.C. and the San Francisco Bay where Route 50 brought prospectors during the California Gold Rush of 1849. It turned out that the highway that Washington proposed during his presidency led directly to a pot of gold. He increased the wealth of the nation, giving farther justification for referring to him as the father of this country. All of this transpired before Grafton became a town. Although US 50 first brought settlers into the area, it was a whole new form of transportation that gave rise to the city of Grafton. The steam locomotive was invented in the early 1800s, and by the mid-1800s tracks were being laid everywhere. Two railways converged in north-central West Virginia, and the junction point not only gave rise to a community large enough to require a name, it gave a name to the community as well. In 1852 the fast-growing community surrounding the railroad junction began to be recognized as a town. And it was given its name because two railways grabbed together in that town, and so Grafton it was called, and still is to the day. The railroad quickly became the primary method of travel fueling the western expanse of America. The rise of the steam locomotive not only increased the market for coal, it also increased the efficiency with which it could be transported. The northeastern United States was transformed by the Industrial Revolution, and a vast number of factories built between 1760 and 1840 were now the foundation of the northern states' economy. They faced stiff competition from European countries, and an affordable supply of coal was essential for the North to win their trade war. This made the coal fields of Western Virginia one of the nation's most valuable assets. Big money from the north wanted to upscale mining operations in Western Virginia, but the state of Virginia, which was covered from the other side of the Eastern Continental Divide, was not on the same page. Virginia was not at all interested in striking a deal with northern industry leaders. From a Virginian perspective, they were already the ones doing the giving and they didn't need anything from the northern states. It was widely recognized throughout the southern states that they were growing the bulk of the food that was feeding the nation. The Industrial Revolution had caused much of the northern population to abandon farms and seek factory jobs in the city. The more urban the north became, the more incapable it became to produce its own food. At first, families in cities could keep chickens, a couple goats or sheep, and sometimes a milk cow outside their home to help put food on the table. But as the cities began growing upward instead of outward, this became impossible for most and restricted for most of the rest. Increasingly, the southern states were called up for agriculture, and now they were being hounded to mine more coal. The southern gentleman usually was an overseer of a single plantation. The number of men working for him, whether they were slaves or hired whites, was limited. Also, his treatment of his employees and indentured servants was kept in check by the fact that he was outnumbered and vulnerable to an uprising or revolt. The plantation master were the most affluent men in the South. The only positions hired were the government office, which were usually occupied by the most successful plantation owner. The industrial infrastructure of the North was largely in the hands of a relatively small number of wealthy tycoons. They only appeared before the laboring masses when they chose, and they only had to deal directly with the men they handpicked to be corporate leaders. Their homes were far removed and guarded from the working class. These tycoons were locked in a cutthroat game of monopoly with one another, and the coal field of Western Virginia were sought after like Boardwalk and Park Place. Meanwhile, the leaders of Virginia felt no pressure to act whatsoever and no obligation to aid and tycoon with their quest for world domination. That was about to change because a growing sentiment against slavery was already taking root. Even though industrial tycoons who came to be known as robber barons ruled over tens of thousands of workers opposed to dozens. Even though sometimes those workers and their families sometimes lived in conditions worse than some slave quarters, they were paying for services, not buying and selling human lives. A man named John Brown, who was armed with Holy Scripture as well as guns, began a holy war in the Midwest, and he brought that war to Harper's Ferry, Virginia in the fall of 1859, when the junction town of Grafton was a mere 7 years old. John Brown held the belief that any man who felt that he had the right to enslave a man had chosen to forfeit his own right to live. His mission to spur the abolition of slavery in America culminated in the raid of the National Armory in Harper's Ferry. 2 of John Brown's sons were killed during the raid, and John Brown was captured and sentenced to death by hanging for acts of treason. The topic of abolishing slavery was suddenly on all the newspapers and was being discussed at many of the dinner tables throughout America. John Brown had given the movement the martyr, a man who was killed for actions that were intended to bring freedom to an oppressed race of people. One can only guess as to whether or not the hanging of John Brown 11 months prior to the election of 1960 determined the outcome, but it certainly lit a burden under the issue, and slavery was a topic that could not be avoided during the campaign. The abolition of slavery was a cornerstone of the Republican Party, and Lincoln vowed to stay true to that agenda if elected. However, he condemned the actions of John Brown. Abraham Lincoln was elected on November 6, 1860, and sworn in on March 4, 1861. Less than 3 months after he took office, the state of Virginia voted to secede from the Union. We all know the horror and bloodshed that followed as the nation fell into the turbulence of civil war. Turning our attention back Western Virginia, where the focal point of this essay, Grafton WV, was in its 9th year of having a name, the northern robber barons now had justification and the support of Union forces to begin moving men into the coal fields of Western Virginia. That high rugged Eastern Continental Divide presented a difficult barrier for troops in Eastern Virginia to rush to the defense of the western part of the state. Cut off from the support of the Confederate States by mountains and easily accessed from the north by Union forces in Pennsylvania and Ohio, delegates in Western Virginia began meeting in Wheeling to discuss the fate of Western Virginia even before decision in Richmond to secede was made in Richmond. Initial voting was in favor of remaining part of a single Virginia government, but soon after Richmond's succession on the 23rd of May, the consensus of the delegates shifted, and by July 1st of 1861 the Western delegates had reached an agreement with the federal government to remain part of the Union. Thus the federal government restored the right for the Western delegates to function as a state government. Immediately groundwork began for the formation of a new state. The process took just under 2 years for West Virginia to formally become recognized as a new state on June 20, 1863. The war continued on for another 2 years, but reform in West Virginia began immediately. For some big-time investors in the North, West Virginia's coal was far more important than the abolition of slavery. They sent in their very best men to oversee the increase of mining operations, and soon scores of immigrant miners were brought in to carry out the work. This was a period of booming growth for Grafton, and a very impressive downtown market area bustled, and it gave rise to businesses to meet the needs of the working class, businesses to appeal to the tastes and expectations of the wealthy, and businesses to fill all the gaps in between. This exciting time of American history is known worldwide as the American Old West. Structurally speaking, Grafton is like a time capsule to that long-gone era of the western expanse and railroad boomtowns. It also showcases some architecture that makes it clear that its builders expected the days of prosperity to continue indefinitely. Downtown architecture culminated with the building a new monumental B&O railroad station at the beginning of the 20th century. The impressive Willard Hotel was added next door soon after. These two buildings stand intact as a shining testimony to Grafton's former vitality. In the same year of 1912, when some people had the misfortune of boarding the Titanic, more fortunate people were boarding a westbound train from the East Coast. They ascended the Allegheny Mountains, and coasted down the other side into a deep wilderness. Alas, they see the forest open into a valley, and they arrive at a booming town on the western frontier, complete with saloons, a theater, deluxe accommodations, a broad assortment of shops, and various dining opportunities. These lucky travelers encountered the unique culture and personality of the native West Virginians, and they met fellow travelers from a wide variety of origins. To the travelers of that era, Grafton was the first stop in the western frontier, thus the original gateway to the West. Indeed, upon becoming a citizen of Grafton, I have learned why the word West was and is important to the name of the state. Not only because of what it has meant to the past, but what it can mean to the future. The original heyday of downtown Grafton was cut short by the automobile. It began to make its appearance on the streets of Grafton at a time when more people were arriving by train and filling the walkways. Grafton had developed to the point that city began running cable cars down Main Street, A.K.A. US Route 50. This just so happened to coincide with the point in time when more and more people got automobiles. Suddenly Main Street in downtown Grafton became too congested with traffic. The natural solution seemed to be a rerouting of US Route 50 so the automobiles could bypass Grafton and not congest traffic and put a damper on the perfect traveler experience that so many business owners and city planners had worked so hard to achieve. The rerouting of US Route 50 became yet another feat smoothly accomplished, and perhaps just in the nick of time because it was becoming clear that automobile was going to become the norm, not the exception, for working class families. Unfortunately no one foresaw what that was going to do to passenger train travel. As more and more automobiles bypassed downtown Grafton without even knowing it existed, less and less people arrived on board the trains. The travelers that did arrive walked through Main Street began to see desperation in eyes of business owners, and desperation is a natural deterrent to patronage. By the time the cable cars became no longer necessary, shops were closing left and right. Automobiles traveling east and west cross-country Route 50 missed out on Grafton's unique micro-majesty, and the money they would have spent in Grafton cruised on over to Clarksburg 20 miles away. Eventually passenger trains stopped running through Grafton altogether and the interstate highway system made even U.S. RT-50, George Washington's Frontier Highway, rarely used for cross-country travel. Yet still Grafton remains, and there is no longer desperation in the eyes of inhabitants. Local citizens have long stopped expecting outside money to fall onto their laps from the pockets of excited travelers. Now the most noteworthy looks to be seen in the eyes of the people along Main Street are within the sockets of a people discovered downtown Grafton by chance or because of someone recommended that should. On their face are expressions of surprise and delight because they've seen clear a glimpse into a marvelous past. Upon experiencing that glimpse into past, most inner eyes also form a vision of the potential for revival of Grafton tourism. With its monumental train station and hotel, vacant but very much intact, Grafton, West Virginia is ripe for renaissance. A few new businesses have now taken root and joined with the old, and a growth spurt in the arts is already evident. If the railway were to reopen to passenger trains, Easterners would no doubt flock for an opportunity to ride over the Continental Divide for a taste of the Old West and to help forge a new West. But until then, I will just consider myself lucky to be in on one of America's best kept secrets.